You are now tuned in to the Bass Gorilla Podcast. You are about to discover the best kept secrets in bass music and EDM production. Through exclusive interviews with the world's favorite producers and record label owners. Dubstep, drum and bass, Neurohop, glitch hop, and other futuristic bass music. Brought to you by Zen Flex.
Hello, and welcome to the Bass Gorilla Podcast. My name is Robert Fumo. I'll be your host today. Usually on this podcast, we have a standard interview kind of format, but this time, we're going to actually dive deep into a specific song, a release by an artist that I'm sure you know of, her name, Ill-Esha, and her song, Hologram Midnight. Back in the day, Ill-Esha was the first female drum and bass performer to mix records, sing, and MC simultaneously, and developed a diverse style by doing so, whilst blending electronic music genres such as broken beats, hip-hop, breaks with drum and bass during her sets. Most recently, Ill-Esha has been inspired by future bass, the 80s, and galactic soundscapes. Her most recent full-length album, Hyperbolic Space Crotchet, is out via acclaimed producer Starkey and his boutique label, Seclusiuses. She's also released several glitch/dubstep EPs on San Francisco-based Moody Music and Austin-based label Gravitas Recordings. So without further ado, I bring you Ill-Esha and her track, Hologram Midnight.
My name is Alicia, and I'm a music producer, instrumentalist, and otherwise sound designer from Vancouver, British Columbia, currently living in Denver, Colorado. I've been doing music basically my entire life, and I've always noticed that Colorado has been this really nice mix of urban sort of music development and kind of like a great scene, but also really kind and unpretentious people. And so it's interesting because I have a very musical background, but very opposite to the music that I do now. My parents and beyond my parents, my whole family, especially on my dad's side, they're all kind of classical musicians, and that's kind of been a thing. Like my cousin is a very accomplished clarinetist with the Pittsburgh Symphony, and so I was always raised with the understanding that music was essential and important, but in a very rigid format. I took classical piano from the ages of 4 till 12. My parents said, okay, you are now allowed to quit. I said, cool, I'm quitting, and I bought a bass guitar and started kind of jamming around in bands. In retrospect, I'm very, very glad that I was forced to play piano because it's such a huge skill, I think, as a producer and a composer to be able to express yourself that way. But I was definitely not brought up like that. And in fact, my parents are not very into popular music. So it's very interesting to me to interact with other people and then say, oh, my parents listen to rock and they listen to this and this and pop, because my mom did a little bit, but mostly my parents listened to classical world music and folk. And that's just, they to this day, they still don't really get kind of like dance stuff in the context I do it, but they've always been supportive of music, which I'm very lucky for. I've always been a big fan of retro space type things like old science fiction and things like that. And I was fortunate enough to tour with Starkey a couple years ago, who's also hugely into that stuff. And we kind of geeked out together on, vintage space design and things like that. And touring with him and his modular synth and all this amazing twinkly soundscapes kind of really brought me back thinking to like, okay, like there is a certain amazingness about analog synth compilations. It's not just in the sound of it, it's not just the warmth or whatever, it's the composition kind of limitations. And by that I mean we have like all these VSTs now that can do anything you want and you can make any sound, but in a way that choice is almost daunting. So in a way I was kind of inspired by the limitation of the fact that Starkey had to set up his synth and tune it like it was an instrument every night. And the music that was coming out of it was so exquisite that it made me think, okay, I'm gonna like start playing around with a more limited palette. I'm gonna go with the 80s, 90s, and that's kind of like the intro and the breakdowns and the genesis of the track was me going, okay, how can I create this soundscape? Okay, no, like don't go on all the crazy Serum modern routings and stuff. Like go back to arpeggiators, go back to like a more simple yet vintage palette, and that's kind of what started it. And then going out from there, it was just kind of a task of, okay, what's a sound that I can play that's really like banging to me, that hits that other side of me that like wants to dance. And that's sort of like the genesis of the whole track, I think. Hologram Midnight was just kind of like this, I usually name my tracks. It's very funny. I used to be an MC. I still rap sometimes. And so I have a lot of random words and notes kind of floating through my head at every given moment. So when I start a track, I'll usually just name it the first random phrase that pops into my head. And for this one, because I was already doodling around with this like 80s sci-fi thing, I was like, what does this make me think of? Well, shredding my guitar with a giant pink mullet, a la Gem and the Holograms. And the midnight part is just it's the dark part of it. It's sort of like the place between space and looking at the stars and something dark and industrial. And once it drops, it's more like you're in a metal warehouse. You're not out on the spaceship, and you're inside the spaceship instead of out of it. Another thing that you can probably notice is that the searing retro leads, that is an influence that has come back from actually taking up guitar and playing that at live shows. And that also, of course, spearheaded this vintage retro thing. Is when you start to think about soloing on a guitar, it definitely changes the way you write. So drums for me, they're always kind of set up the same way. I use battery, or if I'm using Ableton, I'll use drum racks. Anything that kind of puts drum samples into a MIDI format, and that's because I play them in. So it's much easier for me as an audio intuitive person than a visual person to deal with MIDI and playing it. And usually my drums are all sent to a master drum bus that has some kind of analog saturation distortion. I've tried a few different things. I really like the PSP Vintage Warmer, but there's other things like Waves NLS. There's a lot of plugins out there now that are desperately trying to emulate analog warmth, and I am a fan of that sound. So they're always going through that and smashing. For percussive elements, I'm a big fan of layering as well, because I don't really like to use anything straight out of the box, but also using Foley and personally recorded sounds. It's like the reverberations and the sounds happening around it that create a rhythm, and I've built entire tracks around that. For this one, there is a water thud kind of sound. And I noticed that these large metal mixing bowls I had, if they had a little water in them and I hit the side of the sink, they would make this weird... So that's just me throwing the metal bowl of water against the sink and pushing it up and down on a sampler, yeah. And adding not even that much effects, because it's got this, like I said, this natural kind of slap back of water sloshing around, and like it's very subtle things like that, and in the end they'll kind of get buried in a way, but they also will create that natural unquantized kind of groove that I really like so much. So for this song, it's actually like, I don't know that you would necessarily notice it a ton, but it's kind of almost its own lead element in terms of the percussion. For instance, this dripping marimba. That marimba is a product of me playing around with a marimba sample in Omnisphere and then the Interspace imprints on top of it. Just to give you an example, they have they've textural space transients, so like you can use like a gas flame or rice on a plastic bag or a gas flamed string, and this isn't just names. Like if this is gas flamed string, they have gone out into a field and like lit a string on fire with gasoline and recorded it. I mean, I guess the core of what I'm trying to communicate as an artist right now is that everyone should be communicating more, and we don't have time to go into this like majestic grand scope of the world, but ultimately I think all the problems that we encounter as humans, as artists, as anything, is from a lack of understanding and relating. And never underestimate the power of working with people more or less experienced than you, because that's just a further understanding and collaboration, and musically it's a beautiful thing. So that's it.
And now, a full playthrough of Ill-Esha's track, Hologram Midnight. Thank you for listening to the Bass Gorilla podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. If you want to hear some particular artists, go ahead and leave that in the comments section. If you have any other ideas, concepts, let us know. Also, head over to bassgorilla.com. You can check out our library of premium tutorial series done by top artists. Also, we have a huge library on YouTube with tons of free content. And until next time, we'll catch you in the studio.
Dubstep, drum and bass, Neurohop, glitch hop, and other futuristic bass music. Brought to you by Zen Flux. Thank you for listening to the Bass Gorilla Podcast.